Hello, thank you for joining. We'll be starting momentarily. In the meantime, please go ahead and tell us about yourselves with 3 quick poll questions. First question is, where are you joining us from? We tried to pick the different regions in the US, other if you're international. Great, and it looks like, okay, vast majority from the East Coast, and then a bit from the Midwest and West, viewers from Southwest and other. Great, I know I'm based in Providence. We have panelists in Boston, New York, so that seems to be a fair representation of our East Coast group. Another poll that we'll be asking here is, what industry are you in? So, great, and thanks again all to those who are signing on to the webinar. We're just doing a few quick poll questions as folks join. This question is, what industry are you in? Just getting a pulse for who's joining us today. Great, and it looks like, okay, majority in public sector and nonprofit, followed by financial services, some in retail, and a number in other. Looks like we have financial consulting, and one of the other groups. So great, glad y'all are joining from a number of different industries here. And then one last poll question before we jump in. Is your company employing essential workers right now? That question is definitely top of mind for the topic of today's webinar. Even if some folks are probably attending the webinar from home, curious if you have colleagues who are essential workers on the front line. Okay, and it looks like about roughly even split, a little bit more with no, but we do have 43% of folks who joined us today who do have employees on the front lines or who are essential workers. Okay, great. Well, thank you for asking those first few poll questions. Let's go ahead and get started. By the way, if you'd like to post about us on Twitter, please go ahead and use the hashtag COVID financial impact. You can see at the bottom of that slide there. So thank you all again for joining us today. My name is Catherine Wright, and I'll be your moderator. I'm a Senior Innovation Manager at Commonwealth, where I partner across sectors to implement Commonwealth's innovations for increasing financial security for low and moderate income Americans. In the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, while many sectors are downsizing, a few industries such as consumer staples are experiencing peak demand to such a degree that an Amazon employee said that it feels like Prime Day every day. People who work on the front lines are exposing themselves to health risks in order to provide essential goods and services to the rest of the country. I feel this on a personal level because my partner is treating patients in the intensive care unit without sufficient access to PPE. On a community level, I've been reflecting on the inequity in my city where nearby neighborhoods such as East Boston and Hyde Park that are majority Latino and Black are disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus. Residents in these neighborhoods are also more likely to work on the front lines. Today, we'll discuss concrete measures that companies with frontline workers can implement to safeguard the health and financial security of their employees. We have 2 experts who will share their organization's research and recommendations. Allison Omens is the Chief Strategy Officer at Just Capital, which is the only independent nonprofit that tracks, analyzes, and engages with large corporations and their investors on how they perform on the public's priorities. Timothy Flacca is the Executive Director and co-founder at Commonwealth, a mission-driven organization that builds solutions to make people financially secure. We also want to hear from you, our audience members. Throughout today's agenda, we'll pose a few more poll questions, and we'll reserve time at the end of the webinar to address audience questions. During the webinar, please submit your questions via the question feature in the GoToWebinar panel. You can see that on the screen here in terms of how you submit that question. Great, so that was it for the housekeeping topics. Let's do 2 more poll questions before we hear from Allison and Tim. The next poll question is, what steps are you considering to support your workers at this time? And select all answers that apply here. Okay, again, we're just wrapping up this question. What steps are you taking or considering to support your workers at this time? You know, folks are in different sectors with different abilities to offer up benefits or take steps right now. It looks like that's right. The majority are not in a position to take any action right now, 49%. Doing new or expanded sick time, PTO or health benefits, which will be a big topic for us today. Bonuses or one-time payments. Some doing additional matching of employee charitable contributions. In 24, we'll also be talking about hardship grants, so good to see that 24% are looking at new or expanded hardship grants as well. And one more poll question before we jump into questions with Tim and Allison. What length of an economic slowdown are you preparing for? I know news updates every day, and it oftentimes feels like anyone's guess, but we're curious sort of how you all are thinking about this right now at your companies. Okay, great. Again, just wrapping up this question, what length of an economic slowdown are you preparing for? And it looks like we'll get the answers coming in here. Most folks are saying 6 to 12 months. About 34% thinking that, with 3 to 6 and 12 to 18 close seconds, pretty evenly distributed across here, with 6 to 12 being the majority. Yeah, time will tell. Okay, great. Well, thank you all for participating in those poll questions. We'll have another poll midway through the webinar here. But let's go ahead and get started with questions for the panelists. So Allison, this first question is for you. The coronavirus pandemic and impending recession have created an urgent, unprecedented opportunity for CEOs and corporate leaders to put the promise of purpose-driven leadership and stakeholder capitalism into practice. Just Capital has created the Corporate Response Tracker. Allison, what policies and practices have companies with frontline workers implemented in response to the pandemic?
Well, first, thank you for having me, and I hope everyone on the line is staying well and loved ones are staying well as well. So Just Capital is a nonprofit that tracks companies on corporate performance on stakeholder capitalism. Obviously, our mission has become a lot more acute and real in the last 4 or 5 weeks. Understanding how companies are thinking about their stakeholders, particularly their workers, in this global crisis, economic and health crisis, is a lot different in thinking about it right now than it was in an up economy a couple months ago. So what we've decided to do and launched about 2.5 weeks ago is a tracker that is looking at the 100 largest publicly traded employers in the United States to track announcements and policy changes having to do with COVID-19 and the resulting economic fallout. What you're seeing on your screen right now is our current data that reflects that reality. Again, this is the 100 largest employers in the US. What you're seeing is we're tracking 16 different dimensions of behavior, primarily focused on workers, customers, and communities. But we're looking at everything from adjusted hours of operation to layoffs and furloughs to work from home policies to paid sick leave policies. And just to go to the next slide, really what we are learning is that essentially we've seen, so we are looking at companies who are largely in retail, hospitality, the 100 largest employers. So it is a mix of industries, but it tends to be a number of companies with significant frontline workforce. 38% of them have announced new or expanded paid leave policies. 27 have announced bonuses or hazard pay, and 19 have announced backup dependent care. We have really great case studies and sort of best practices that I'll get into in a little bit. Target is a standout in terms of their sort of holistic approach to recognizing that their frontline workers need not just sort of job protection, but also have dependent care issues, need flexibility, et cetera, et cetera. So moving on to the next one, and again, you can see all of this at justcapital.com. It will be up with both updated data and expanded data launching likely next Wednesday. So check back again next Wednesday, but this is all sortable by issue as well as company, so you can see every company and how they're reacting. In terms of paid sick leave in particular, which obviously is the most important issue sort of from protecting people's health on the job, most companies are offering between 10 and 14 days of paid sick leave in response to COVID-19. There's a real range in terms of accessibility. A number of practices have to do with being confirmed COVID, which obviously in this low testing environment is a high bar. But we are seeing paid sick leave expand. Most of it, as I said, is related to confirmed or COVID related issues, but this really is a step forward in terms of frontline workers and access to programs that they didn't have before. I think there's one more slide. And then the other piece of information on bonuses and financial assistance, and obviously being on a webinar hosted by Commonwealth, this is an area of importance to you as well. We're seeing about of the companies that have provided bonuses and financial assistance, 45% are hazard pay, so recognizing that the jobs right now require a higher level of compensation, and then 21% bonus and 33% bonus, and then 21% grant in case of hardships.
Great.
So overall, just to say, we've seen a number of practices in an environment, I know there's a lot of companies on the line that's extraordinarily both financially and operationally challenging. Companies have invested and pushed through a number of new policies across the board in terms of recognizing the importance of these issues, and there's still a long way to go. We're sort of seeing updates in real time. We've seen a number of companies implement new policies 4 or 5 or 6 times in 3 weeks. So we know that being on the front line on the corporate side of having to deal with this implementation is also a real challenge and something we're going to continue to track.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing this data, Allison. I know it's tremendous, the amount that, I don't know how you all do it over at Just, how quickly you collect all the data and put it all together here, but really important, and to recognize that that's right, folks are responding very quickly, and policies and practices are changing on a week-to-week basis. Related to that point on bonuses and financial assistance, Tim, I'm wondering, we're in this unique moment where essential employees may be actually able to save a bit of their increased pay or stimulus money from the CARES Act as well. Based on Commonwealth's research, what are the best practices for encouraging employees to build emergency savings?
Yeah, thanks so much, Catherine. And just a shout out to all of you who are taking time to join us today. We were commenting before we got on the line today how for many of us, it's been an extraordinarily busy time in the COVID crisis era, and we appreciate you making time to join us. So on the topic of savings, this is so important. Many of the workers that you all employ or have access to, the crisis may not have hit full force for them and for their households yet. For many of them, it may have, but for those of us who are still looking ahead, there's an intense desire to build up some savings, and we have already seen that in our work, anecdotally, talking with partners about their employees and their stakeholders, and we know this from prior economic downturns and recessions that savings rates tick upward because it's intuitive that when times are uncertain, we want to have that cushion, that that emergency savings buffer that is in some ways the Swiss Army knife of solving financial challenges, because savings is so flexible and can be used to solve so many issues. So from an employer's perspective, there are really three things that I would encourage you to think about that are important assets that you can bring to your workers and will really meet this really pressing need to build savings. And the first one may be easy to overlook, which is simply the bully pulpit that you have as the employer to talk about savings, to remind people about the importance of savings, and to do what you can to make it easy for them to act on this impulse that I said many of us are already going to have. But whether that's an email that you send out, or a posting on your company's intranet, if that fits, or a stuffer in a paycheck, or a million other ways that you will know what's the best fit for your culture and your workers, just simply talk about savings is sort of step one. A related part of that is we know from lots of research by many people over many years, including our own work, that people are more likely to save when they pre-commit, when they take a step in advance. And so you may want to consider messaging to say when that bonus payment comes, when that raise comes, when the overtime pay hits, or when that CARES economic, so it's not economic stimulus payment, economic impact payment hits. Consider now if you'd like to put some of those funds into savings. The second thing is that employers have this important asset to help us follow through on our savings intent, and that's access to the payroll system. And so that can take the form of payroll deduction, if you have that as an option, to allow deposits into savings. Or the other one that is widely overlooked, but a really important asset, is split direct deposit. And that just simply means that most payroll systems will allow workers to specify more than one destination for their net pay. And so we can sign up and have $5 a pay period, or 5%, or some regular amount automatically go directly into a savings product or tool. This is, again, a feature that's generally available to payroll systems without any additional build out, but it's widely overlooked and not understood, and is a really value add for workers. And the last point is that many of us actually don't have a good place to save. And this may be a surprise for some of us who feel as if we live in a world of bank branches on every corner, and a savings account seems like a fairly plain vanilla product. In fact, the AARP last year did some research and found that half of American households, 53%, reported they don't have an emergency savings account. The FDIC has done work on this for years and tells us that nearly 29% of us lack savings accounts, and even more startling, 45% of Black households and 46% of Hispanic households don't have a savings account. So this may be a stretch as the employer to think that you have a role to play in that, but in fact, there are examples of employers partnering for the local credit union or a local bank to make savings and banking products available to your workers. Those are sort of the rapid response things, would be to call that local bank or that local credit union and ask if they'd like to have the ability to message your workers who need an account. There are more elaborate solutions as well. There are now many fintechs that can help solve this problem. We have resources at Commonwealth to work with employers who are interested in deeper solutions under the Emergency Savings Initiative, the BlackRock Emergency Savings Initiative. So please reach out if that is something that you'd like some more customized help with.
Great, thanks so much, Tim. I appreciate that sort of range of things that are pretty low touch and quick to implement, and some things that maybe are a little bit more effort, but also solid solutions there. Through Commonwealth's recent interviews with low and moderate income Americans across sectors, we've noticed that COVID-19 has exacerbated difficult trade-offs between physical health and financial health. I'm curious to both Allison and Tim, for your thoughts on this. What are company benefits that can mitigate the need to make that trade-off, again, between physical health and financial health?
Well, the first thing to acknowledge is that there shouldn't be a trade-off between physical health and financial health. And that's true for the individual, for workers, and it shouldn't also be true for companies. There shouldn't be a question of keeping your workers on the job or keeping your business running. And so I think both of those things are longer term structural questions that need to be answered. But in the short term, the most immediate thing is paid sick leave. I mentioned this when I was talking before, but paid sick leave is vital to protect both workers and consumers. It's the first line of defense to protect against COVID, as well as any number of other illnesses. And it's crucially important for financial security. No one should be choosing between putting food on their family's table and losing their job, and their health and that of the health of their families and customers. Before COVID-19, many low-wage workers and frontline workers lacked access to paid sick leave. Only 47% of workers in the 25th percentile, so that lowest chunk of wage earners, had access. What we've seen in the last couple of weeks is that companies, as I said before, are expanding access to paid sick leave, but oftentimes there's sort of structural issues associated with it. So that's the confirmed case of COVID. And, you know, for any company on the line, I think it's really important to be looking at that and sort of recognizing that in a, you know, high intensity environment, what we're seeing is that people don't actually have access to the paid sick leave that oftentimes a company may think that they do. 8 companies of the 100 that we're assessing have those high barriers to entry, and on average 13 days. People have access to 13 days, which is obviously 1 day less than the CDC recommended number of isolation. We have seen a number of best practices. One of my favorite examples, and this sort of goes back to the long-term thinking, Darden Restaurants, a couple of days after this all really got intense, announced their new paid sick leave policy. That was something that had been in the works for a long time, and so it allowed them to be ahead of the game in terms of having a structure and procedures in place and recognizing that there's long-term health benefits for the company associated with providing paid sick leave to frontline workers. This week, in the last day and a half, Home Depot has announced a really significant best of class paid sick leave policies. It's applicable to both full-time and part-time workers, straight PTO, and then additional paid time off if you do have a confirmed case of, or if you need to be quarantined for any reason. So what we are beginning to see, and I think what we hope to see based on what people's priorities are, is that there becomes a race to the top on this issue, that the protection of, you know, the recognition that this should not be a trade-off is sort of understood across the board, and that there are solutions that companies are seeking. And we are seeing that, as I said, through best practices, that solutions are being sought by companies on how to protect the health of their workforce, the health of their consumers, and the health of the company all at the same time.
And I would just, there's one particular area that I would highlight and really encourage you to think about if it applies in your organization, and that is the high deductible health plans, which have really taken over a lot of the health insurance offerings from employers. Many of them are not paired with health savings accounts, and that was the original intention of that design, that if we have really high deductibles, we have to have a companion product where we build up some savings to be able to pay for those deductibles. And the effect is that people who the employer may think they have health insurance, but from their perspective, if they go to the doctor or seek care, they know they're going to have to pay that first, it could be several $1,000s of expense. And when there's no health savings account with funds earmarked for that purpose, the effect is people don't use the healthcare system because they know it has an immediate financial impact. And it's a sort of common sense observation that employers don't go to all of the effort and expense to offer health insurance and health care for their workers, only to have those very same workers not access it when they need it. And so it seems like a really important missing piece. And there's sort of 2 layers. A lot of firms that have high deductible health plans have not been able or haven't chosen to put in place health savings accounts at all. And then even fewer are making contributions into those health savings accounts on behalf of their workers. And so this is something to really think about in this environment. You know, obviously higher wages are another way, but that is not going to be the right fit for everybody. but putting funds into an earmarked health savings account specifically for health expenses is a way to signal, first of all, that you understand this is an issue and a concern for your workers, that it's really hard to make the decision to go to the doctor when that goes directly onto your, out of your spending money. And secondly, to put funds aside that are earmarked specifically for that purpose. And for those of you who are not deeply familiar with health savings accounts, they have a good deal of flexibility. The range of expenses that one can pay out of a health savings account is typically much broader than the health insurance plan that it's attached to. So prescription drugs or dental care or other kinds of care that might come up and may or may not be covered on your plan can often or typically be paid for out of a health savings account. And the very final point, in this moment when it may seem a little odd to say to somebody, here are some resources to cover a doctor's visit, but you can't use them for something else. Well, in fact, with a health savings account, a worker can make the decision to take those funds out and to spend them on something other than healthcare. There are just tax implications for that, but typically those tax implications are less substantial the lower the income of the worker. So there is a way in which health savings account contributions have a sort of secondary benefit of people being able to draw on them for other purposes if they really need to. So that's something I'd really encourage employers to think carefully about.
Great. Thank you both for those thoughtful answers. And I really appreciate the point. There shouldn't have to be this trade-off at all between financial health and physical health in terms of, paying medical bills versus paying other expenses such as food, or at the company level of, do I go to work and expose myself, or, do I try to stay safe? Ideally, we'd be able to handle both, but I know it's such a challenging time right now. I also I love the language, Allison, of the race to the top. I think that's great to think about that more, and love those examples with Darden and Home Depot. So I know it's an interesting point that Darden had already started to implement that prior to the coronavirus. We're thinking sort of like pre, during, and post COVID-19. So it's time for another audience poll. I'm curious if your company has implemented changes to employee benefits. Do you plan on continuing them after the pandemic? It's hard to know at what point we actually might be past this pandemic at this point, but curious if you all in the audience have insights into this at this point, sort of how you're thinking about these benefits or changes that you might have implemented. And that could be anything from work from home policy to paid sick leave, as Allison was talking about, or other policies that you've put in place. Okay, a solid maybe from the audience. I know it's definitely hard to, as I mentioned, even predict when we'll be past this pandemic, and in terms of whether to continue policies after that, it's really hard to know. So pretty even split there. Thank you to audience members who participated in that poll. So this next question is for Tim, and is actually related to a question we received from the audience from MJ at Hertz. Even frontline workers who may be experiencing increased demand for work, these employees are still experiencing hardships from either sick or unemployed family members, childcare demands, all sorts of hardships right now. Prior to the pandemic, Commonwealth surveyed companies that had hardship grants and identified best practices for that. Curious, based on Commonwealth research, what are your recommendations, Tim, for companies implementing hardship grants?
Yeah, thanks for that question. We've seen a lot of interest in this, understandably, and just to take a brief step back, hardship funds are programs operated by companies to provide cash assistance in moments of hardship, as the name would suggest. And if you haven't come across these, they have really become much more widespread in corporate America. Blue chip companies, the Home Depots, the PetSmarts, the JetBlues, the Walmarts operate funds like this, and some folks are a little surprised to know that. So that's important context. Catherine, you mentioned the research that we've done, and we did have a chance to do that together with our friends at the Aspen Institute and Rachel Schneider, the author of the Financial Diaries. And what we found by talking to many workers who had applied for and received assistance from these funds is that they produce an incredibly high return on investment. workers are just really perhaps surprised, but definitely delighted and grateful that their employers offer a tool like this. And what we've seen is that gratitude and that goodwill that's engendered leads to business benefits. In our work, 64% told us that they were less distracted at work after receiving hardship assistance from the fund, which is intuitive, but important to see that data. 72% said they were more likely to stay with their current employer as a result of that hardship fund. So to the extent that you're thinking about making the case for this work, that's important data. It's not a huge leap to quantify the cost of turnover and the cost of productivity and see why there's a rationale for that. The second thing I would say is that we did see there are good ways to run these funds and there are less good ways. And the simple formula there is you really want to run a dignified process for the workers. Workers told us with great clarity and insight that they want a fair process. They understand in many cases that it can be helpful to have some criteria for what sorts of hardships a fund will cover. They weren't surprised by that, but they want that process to be fast so they get the answer they need. They want it to be fair and they want it to be dignified. So as an example where a fund chose to call a medical provider and essentially verify their story, that was, the worker felt that was really humiliating when they then saw that same physician later and had to have that person say, I was caught off guard to be called, in my practice by your employer's hardship fund to ask about, whether you had had a medical experience. So that may be an extreme example, but just keeping that word dignity in mind. And the last thing I would say is that these exist in a lot of different forms in terms of what hardships are covered. And one variation has to do with whether the company is paying for the hardship fund or whether the workers are. And we've seen actually that a combination can be very powerful. There are a lot of examples of workers, particularly your highly paid workers, who want to be able to contribute close to home, if you will, to their coworkers. And a hardship fund provides a dignified way and a way with privacy protection and a way where they don't have to make judgment calls about who they're going to support for them to make those sorts of contributions. So I would keep that in mind, especially if at this moment your business is under a lot of financial pressure. It can be tough to say, let's just take on this new expense. You may find that some of your better paid workers actually will welcome the opportunity to contribute to their colleagues. And the very last point on the question that came in around how do you do this sustainably? What we found, and you can take this for better and for worse, is that the goodwill engendered by these funds was not actually tied to whether they solved completely the underlying hardship situation. And we're ambivalent about that finding because, of course, we would like to solve those issues for employees. But I think it's important to, in this context, to say doing something is better than doing nothing. And you may be rewarded in an outsized way for taking that step and setting up a fund or expanding a fund or publicizing the availability of an existing fund, even if you know that you may not be able to meet the full extent of every demand. So that seems important in terms of the sustainability question.
Great. Excellent. Thanks so much, Tim. Yeah, I appreciate that point of the idea of companies supporting or, contributing to these funds, but then also higher income employees, giving them the opportunity to contribute. I was really struck at the outset of this virus with the peer-to-peer bill paying of people just signing up to pay strangers' bills and sort of the outpouring of, those who are in a position to be able to support others really wanting to find that connection right now. Great. So, Allison, the headlines have shown that a handful of companies are increasing hourly wages of frontline workers, in some cases by $2 per hour. Just Capital has been tracking these announcements, and I'm curious what trends you've seen so far, and how long you think these pay raises should last for, to the extent that they are categorized as hazard pay right now.
Sure, thank you. So first, there are two types of companies right now, obviously, those that are open and those that aren't. So for the sake of sort of this assessment, what we're really looking at is those that are, and in many cases seeing demand increase, which we know that's the stories about Amazon and Walmart, and the levels of demand, as I said, that we're seeing. hazard pay sort of as a concept has always traditionally been applied to other types of industries, but in this context, as we know, if any of us has gone to the grocery store in the last month, workers on the front line in pharmacies, hospitals, obviously retail, are putting their health on the line by continuing to come to work, and companies are responding as a result of that and recognizing that that they do need to be paying higher wages almost universally temporarily. So we've seen a little less than 30% of companies announce pay raises, bonuses, or new grant programs. Among those companies, 45% are offering hazard pay raises, and that is in most cases temporary. So for example, Amazon's announced a $2 an hour raise through the end of April, and there sort of depends on at what point does it end. It's between $1.50 and $2. But again, you can go to our tracker at justcapital.com and sort through all of the examples of hazard pay and what they're applied to. As I said, sort of the health and the fact that workers are sacrificing their potential physical well-being to be on the job, I think is a really important point. And that's what we're seeing in the short term, that recognition on pay increases. And so the question will become, in the long term, will we see a reorientation in terms of wages in America? Obviously, that's a really complicated question, again, in a really tough financial situation. But it's something we do extensive polling of the American people, and consistently the top thing people care about is our companies paying fair and living wages. And in these industries that are now seeing these pay increases, the majority are not paying living wages. And so it's going to be really interesting to be tracking and seeing what choices companies are making in the next couple of months, and where are consumers sort of celebrating or rewarding companies that are thinking more long-term about investment in their workforce. And again, the sort of complex financial challenges associated with each individual company, and certainly at an industry level right now, is very complex. But overall, it's been a real trend, this hazard pay, among companies that are still open. Lowe's, for example, increased hourly wages to $2 an hour, and providing a $300 bonus for full-time and $150 for part-time. So again, go to the tracker to see all the specifics, but the trend is towards hazard pay, temporary hazard pay and bonuses, and we'll be tracking to see if that's long-term. As I said, it's something that the American people care deeply about. We know there's a real inequality that is also being shown in the American economy right now, even more acutely. And so we'll continue. And the final point I want to make is that there's a real business case associated with ensuring that workers are not financially distressed. We've worked with, have a good relationship with PayPal, and the CEO of PayPal has in the last year did a assessment of their workforce. Their call center workers realized about 60% of their workers were in financial distress, increased wages, did a number of things, decreased healthcare benefits. And that was because they believe that workers that are more financially secure also lead to better business outcomes. So I think one of the interesting things to watch, and for those those who are working with companies right now, is understanding that there is a business case associated with creating good jobs, that there's more stability, more productivity, retention rates are different. And so that's, I think, the important next conversation that we should be having.
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely agree. As a student of Professor Zainab Tan at MIT Sloan, that's near and dear to my heart, the Good Jobs Institute as well. Yeah, and absolutely the case for employee financial security. I think one of the stats is employees before coronavirus, were financially stressed, and it was causing 13 hours in a given month on average of just time spent stressing at work. So there really is a case for that. I appreciate also, Allison, as you were talking, you're referencing all the polling you do. I think that's so important to get a pulse on the American public's views. I'm curious, sort of as companies continue to respond to the COVID-19 crisis, what does the American public care about most? Are there certain policies or practices that Americans want to see companies adopt more than others?
Thank you. So as I just mentioned, so we've been doing polling for 6 years, representative sample of the American public. We ask people every year what's most important for companies to prioritize, and every year the same answers come back, which is start with wages and benefits, think about sort of the Maslow's hierarchy. Fundamentally, what do people need to stay secure? And then it goes to opportunities for advancement, diversity, equity, and inclusion, safety, which I imagine will rise in our polling this year. We've also recently done more polling, and we're out in the field right now understanding how people are feeling in this crisis. But you know, Americans are split even on how corporate America has responded to COVID-19. 50% think that companies have demonstrated leadership, while the other half believe that they need to do more to step up. So it's still really a mixed bag in terms of how people feel. But I think the important takeaway from our polling is that it's incredibly consistent, that the most important thing people care about from a stakeholder perspective is how a company treats its workforce. And never has there been a moment that reality is so completely on display. So again, that's where we're really going to see how companies respond in the next couple of weeks and months, and see how Americans respond to that.
Absolutely, yeah. In this current time and going forward, I think that's spot on, and that leads to a critical question. In terms, I'm curious your thoughts on this. As parts of the economy start reopening, and eventually this pandemic is behind us, you know, do we think these benefits will still be in place? You know, what is the argument for companies to maintain these benefits when they're often seen only as a cost?
Yeah, this really speaks to the heart of the sustainability question. And I'll just pick up on something Allison has already said so well, which is there are real business benefits. And the challenge is that the costs are really easy to see and the benefits are sometimes harder to quantify. But there's some excellent research, just to choose an example, that documents a causal relationship between long distance truckers having sufficient liquid savings and lower accident rates. You know, just the intuition there is that with that less stress about finances comes less distraction. And in that industry, that translates to less costly in terms of dollars and injuries and lives, accidents. So I like that story because it illustrates, you know, sometimes we have to look a little bit to find those benefits, but there they are. And other ones to keep in mind are shrinkage, right? So those of you who are in retail know that's a constant source of expense, is when part of your inventory disappears for one reason or another. Or many of us are in increasingly essentially customer service industries, and the quality of that customer service, it's so intuitive, at least to me, that I know that when I am stressed and distracted, I am not the best partner, I'm not the best parent, I'm not the best coworker, and I couldn't imagine providing quality customer service when I'm sitting there wondering whether or not my gas is going to get turned off tonight or whether there's going to be enough to pay the rent next week. So I think we have to keep making that point. The second point I would make is that as we, you know, continue the digitalization of the economy, I think we're seeing some firms recognizing that where even as recently as 5 years ago, they had come to see labor costs as simply an expense to be reduced, that increasingly, if they're going to be in a business where they have significant labor costs and they're going to be competing against firms that do not or have less, they have to turn that from a cost center into a differentiator. And the only way you can do that is to invest in that human capital and make sure that those folks, you know, that you're delighted to see a retail worker instead of dealing with a website, that you get a different customer experience when you are sitting in a restaurant than when you interact with an app or whatever the particulars may be. And the last thing I would say is that one observation over a longer period of time is that we have a compensation and a benefits system that has tended to emphasize long-term employees and more highly compensated employees. You know, the easiest example to point to would be something like a pension plan, where the lion's share of the resources that go into a pension plan are paid out to people who have very long tenure and also to people who had high wages. Obviously, pension plans are kind of extinct or growing extinct, so it's just to illustrate the point. But I think one of the things we need to think about is that in an increasingly mobile, increasingly 21st century workforce, we need to shift that balance so more of those compensation and benefits dollars are flowing to the shorter tenure and to the lower comped workers. And that'll get you to things like sick pay over pension plans in an extreme example. So those are a few things to think about in terms of the long term.
I love the long-term or the trucking example. It's such a clear one of the types of things we aren't even thinking about measuring. So thank you for sharing that. The only thing I'll add, I thought, Tim, everything you said was amazing. The real question on my mind and on our mind right now is, are we going to be going back to business as usual, or are we going to be going in a different direction? And I think that what we know up until now of what business as usual looked like is that it wasn't working that well. It wasn't working that well for a lot of people. And in the last couple of years, we've seen company leadership, CEOs and others really talk about that. The Business Roundtable statement of purpose committing to stakeholder performance and sort of thinking about a company holistically and sort of saying no more shareholder primacy. The theme at Davos this year was stakeholder capitalism. There's been a lot of talk for roughly the last 5-ish years, but in the last couple years, it's become a lot more acute. And that commitment and recognition of where there were shortcomings in the economy and who was falling through the cracks has become just crystal clear in the last month. That 1 in 10 Americans, according to this morning's job numbers, have lost a job in the last month. Obviously, a lot of that has to do with the crisis, but we know that the outcomes connected to that are extremely severe, along the lines of what we've been talking about for the last hour in terms of lack of savings and other sort of key safety net issues. And so what we're sort of looking at and will be measuring and tracking is, do companies sort of use this opportunity? Because we're not going back to business as usual either way. The question is, are we going to be implementing a set of policies that lead to more resiliency? That when there are huge shocks in the economy, companies that don't have the sort of structure in place, like paid sick leave, for example, will see more ups and downs. And that's, there's been a fair number of research, or some research done by Harvard Business School, McKinsey, and others coming out of the Great Recession, that companies that were more long-term stakeholder focused also performed well and continue to exist after the Great Recession. And so I think that's what we're going to see going forward. And at a broad level, obviously that's long-term thinking, but in the immediate term, or sort of at this level, it's the kinds of benefits that we're seeing implemented and wage changes and assessing the impact on community. We haven't talked much about communities today and emergency relief funds and changing manufacturing policies, but there's a lot that we're seeing that I think leads to, and we will be measuring, does lead to better performance outcomes in the long term. And so that's really the question still. But we know that, again, the sort of challenges that companies are facing do lead to different sets of questions, along with policymakers and others than previously are made.
Yep, I think that's on point. Thank you, Allison. And it sort of makes me think of another question that I'm curious what you both think. If some of these essential companies with increased demand right now are hiring temporary workers to meet this, peak demand that ultimately will subside, likely, what happens to these temporary workers when demand levels return to normal? Do we think they'll return to jobs in other sectors? I don't know if any of you have a crystal ball to know that one, but will the improved benefits in consumer staples transfer over to other sectors, such as restaurants or hospitality, once they're in a position to hire again, hopefully sooner rather than later?
Allison, you want to go first on that one?
Maybe
Sure.
a tough question here.
It's hard to know. I think that there's, as I said, 1 in 10 Americans, there's so much slack in the economy right now, and we'll see. But what we do know is that the economy is driven in large part by consumer demand. And so the more quickly we can either keep people on the jobs or get people cash and other support, the better that will be. And companies have a real role to play. There are really serious choices associated with layoffs versus furloughs versus work share programs. And we're seeing the biggest companies in America doing all of those things. And those are the kinds of choices that now will lead to different that will lead to different long-term outcomes and corporate choices. So, again, with a lot of people on the phone, I'm so curious of how you are all talking about this internally. We've had a number of conversations with companies over the last couple of weeks, but there are so many very clear structural challenges associated with our current economic moment that it's hard to articulate what will happen. But I think generally what I'd say Just Capital is optimistic about is that this acceleration, as I was just talking about, of the last couple of years around purpose and business responsibility is going to accelerate, and there are a different set of choices available to companies who come in with that mindset.
And that's great. There are just two thoughts I want to add. One way to understand what's happening right now is we have an unexpected and a very unwelcome natural experiment. And the experiment is something along the lines of some firms are upping their pay and improving their benefits. And the part that we all have to, and I would ask those of us on this call who are in positions of leadership to pay special attention to is, will we see, and I think there's some evidence we're already seeing it, that workers respond to that higher set of benefits and better compensation with greater productivity will be awfully hard to discern in this environment, but the anecdotal measures will be there. And the one that I see just as a regular person in the economy is that these folks are coming to work, and of course that's complicated. Many of us, most of us have to work to survive, but I see in a lot of the frontline workers I come across a real sense of mission, and they're taking pride in the role they play. And so what I'm trying to get to is it will be easy to count up what we paid in the extra bonuses that Allison described. But I think what we, again, have an obligation to do is to also look carefully and say, wow, there was something that we got back for that, we being the employers. And this is a sort of high equilibrium. We've been in many cases in a low equilibrium of we're going to pay as little as possible. And, a rational response on the part of the worker is to then kind of do the minimum necessary. That's obviously simplistic. But this natural experiment is what happens when we go a little bit more towards the other end of trying to pay at the high end of the range and see the highest end of the performance. And I think it would be fabulous if we could walk away from this experience with a sense that that high equilibrium has more of a role to play and fits perfectly with what Allison described, the comments from the Business Roundtable and other conversations. But I think it's going to come down to all of us to look really carefully for the evidence of that payoff. So the second thing I wanted to point out in terms of things under our control is to really amplify something that Just Capital is doing and has said, and that's that we all are consumers too, and can vote with our dollars and our spending patterns. And so I think we have a chance to say it felt better, honestly, to have the person who was serving me a meal to feel like they were being paid a little bit better. And I would rather get my food from somebody who I feel like is able to go home and look after their family. That's where I want my money to go. So I think that's something we all have to carry with us too. And in a way, people in leadership positions in corporate America face a lot of constraints. Many of them have very good intentions. Certainly not all of us do. But we can help those leaders who want to do this work by being responsible consumers and saying back, it was worth it to me to pay a little more. So just a little bit of a plug there.
Great. Yeah, thank you both. I really appreciate those thoughts. And we have a few minutes left here. I wanted to jump to one or two audience questions. These are pretty tactical. I'll throw out 3 questions and you can pick one to answer maybe, and then we'll wrap up here. We have one from Chris L. I think he's referring to the hardship funds, but how do you structure them so that employers can contribute without it being taxable? Or do they just accept it is taxable and perhaps make the workers whole? I think that's for hardship funds, but interpret as you will. One from Audrey P. Does Commonwealth or Just Capital see more employers implementing catastrophic leave policies during the pandemic to allow employees to donate their accrued sick and vacation leave to employees impacted by the pandemic? And then one more question, again, pick whichever one you'd like to answer here. Frank S. Asked, have you seen any kind of small dollar loan programs for displaced workers from the employer or other sources?
I'll jump in a couple of quick answers. In terms of hardship funds, generally setting them up as a separate charity is the classic strategy to avoid those dollars being considered compensation and provide deductibility to the employer. You can look for more of that on a publication called Illuminating the Hidden Safety Net that Commonwealth is a co-author on. You can find that on our webpage, which also has a special section on the COVID crisis. The second thing I would say is there are now some very new actors, like in the last couple of weeks, who for this pandemic have a structure that should allow deductibility under an IRS section called 139. So I would just look for those. I don't know enough about the details to recommend a particular vendor, but these are typically, the one we've seen is built on a health savings account chassis and allows employers to make tax deductible contributions to those cards and then hand them out to their workers. So that's a kind of a short-term, much more turnkey. Last thing on that is there's a great firm that we've worked with called Canary. I don't remember their URL, but they're in this business and probably would be even more knowledgeable about how to quickly set up hardship funds.
And on the second question on the catastrophic relief, we're not seeing that level of detail yet largely. I don't have all of the specific data in front of me. It's not something that we're tracking. We are starting to track more general or granular types of leave policies. One of the sort of interesting trends in this context is that up until now or recently, there's more PTO policies. Anyone who's in company, this is of no surprise, PTO as opposed to paid sick leave policies. So we're seeing a change in paid sick leave policies and seeing more granularity of where policies like that can be connected, but haven't seen so far as I know. But if you'd like to reach out to us separately, happy to look more into it and ask our researchers to connect with you. And again, we're justcapital.com and you can reach us on our website.
Great, thanks so much. And we're almost at the hour here, so we might be able to answer a few more questions via email later on, but thank you to all the audience members who submitted questions. And thank you all for joining this important conversation. I'd like to leave you with a few key takeaways that Tim and Allison really highlighted in our discussion. Companies that support their frontline workers' physical and financial well-being are better equipped to meet the challenging demands of this pandemic. Another takeaway, there are specific steps that essential employers can take, and they include paid sick leave, paid family and medical leave, hazard pay, savings into HSAs and emergency funds, relaxed attendance policies, and hardship funds. And finally, as the economy gradually reopens, we touched on this towards the end, and there may be likely waves of additional quarantine in certain regions, these worker benefits that we mentioned will be essential to maintain a healthy, financially stable staff to serve customers. So as we've been discussing at Just Capital and Commonwealth over these past weeks, this really feels like a critical moment of if not now, then when. This pandemic has demonstrated how vulnerable our economy is and how much we rely on our frontline workers. Americans are looking to employers to improve financial security and worker welfare. Essential employers, you have an opportunity to make a lasting difference and push the boundaries of stakeholder capitalism. This webinar is one in a series that Commonwealth is hosting around the impacts of COVID-19 across various industries. We hope you'll join us again next Thursday and visit buildcommonwealth.org for more information. We'll send out a recording of this webinar by email with information about our other webinars and discussions. Thank you to our speakers, Allison Omens from Just Capital and Timothy Flacca from Commonwealth. Really appreciate your thoughts today. And a massive thank you to the frontline workers who are risking their health to provide essential goods and services for the rest of us. We applaud the companies who are stepping up to safeguard the health and financial security of their employees. Thank you again, and we hope you and your families stay safe and healthy.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you both.